Hey, this evening we're going to be looking at the service of one of the Royal Navy's most active ships from the Revolutionary War era, the 44-gun warship HMS Roebuck. And while she served from 1775 through 1782, we're going to be looking in particular at her service in 1776 and 1777 in the Chesapeake Bay, the Delaware Bay, and the Hudson River. In attempting to subdue the rebellious North American colonies, the British faced a serious challenge given the sheer physical size of their opponent. So the entire landmass of that island is only maybe a fraction of the territory of the colonies. And the coastline for England is about 11,000 miles, depending on how you measure it. Britain was a major sea power. No place on the island was more than 70 miles from the sea. And over the centuries, the British people had relied on the Royal Navy to protect the land, to protect their commerce, and to project their military power across the seas. Though 3,000 miles distant, the North American colonies also relied on the Royal Navy for their protection. Here we see an example of a British naval officer's ideal kind of a sea fight, a stand-up battle with long lines of ships firing away at each other at sea. This is what they trained for. This is what they hoped to earn glory for. Their largest ships, the ones that could handle this kind of a battle, they called ships of the line, major warships, heavy-duty warships. But one problem with the American war was that the colonies were incapable of floating a navy like this. They created warships in dribs and drabs once the conflict started, and they were content to avoid Britain's naval strength and instead to pick away at their enemy guerrilla style using small vessels, privateers, and coastal batteries. So the British needed to adapt to this by expanding the number of their ships that could function in a shallow coastal environment. And to that end, they anticipated this by designing a new class of smaller warships that could handle that kind of riverine and coastal conflict. They designed a new class of ships, fifth-rate, medium-sized warships, larger than a frigate, about double the armament, but still small enough to get into the coastal areas. And the prototype was the HMS Roebuck. They created 19 more ships in this class during the period of the American Revolution. So the Roebuck was designed in 1769. They had an inkling that they might need to be able to function in that environment. It took nearly 4 years to finish her. She was completed on August 4th, 1774, and spent the next year or so cruising around Britain. She cost about 20,000 pounds to build. She's 140 feet long at her gun deck. She had a width or a beam of 38 feet. All right. And her draft, even when she was lightened, she drew over 3 fathoms. Fathom is 6 feet. So she had, at her lightest, an 18.5-foot draft. Anything shallower than that, and she would run ashore. She weighed 880 tons. As you can see, she had 2 gun decks. The lower gun deck had 18-pounders, 20 of them, and the upper gun deck had 22 9-pounders. Later, these were upgraded to 12-pounders. And she also had 2 6-pound guns in the forecastle or forecastle that she could use if she was chasing someone. And she carried a crew of between 250 and 280 men, officers and men. So this is what she might have looked like when she was finished. And you can see that she was among the most magnificent and complex machines of her age. A very complex machine to operate. So a warship is more than just a physical structure, and some warships are more successful than others. This could be due to their construction in part or their unique sailing features, but more than anything, success is due to the esprit of the corps. And the animating spirit of this ship was the Roebuck. A Roebuck could spring lightly across the waves, in this case, challenge its enemies and fight pugnaciously. No one person imbued the Roebuck with spirit more than its commander, Andrew Snape Hammond. The son of a merchant ship owner, he joined the Navy at age 15. 6 years later, he was a lieutenant aboard the Magnamine, a 64-gun warship where he proved his mettle in the British victory over the French at Quiberon Bay under his captain, Captain Richard Howe, the man who would become his patron. Hammond was given command of a series of successively larger ships, 6-gun cutter, an 8-gun sloop. By 1770, at age 36, he was captain of a 90-gun ship of the line, the flagship of his patron, who was now Rear Admiral Richard Howe. Hammond was the man who was chosen to lead the first Roebuck-class ship during its proof of concept. Hammond's relationship with Lord Richard Howe was an important one for both men. Successful leaders surround themselves with capable subordinates, especially in the Navy, where managing a ship requires a highly skilled leader. Howe, one of the ablest naval commanders of his day, exemplified the Royal Navy's strong tradition of attracting and promoting the best sailing men and officers. So it's no surprise that he fostered Hammond's career. A talented naval officer, Hammond went on to serve with great distinction. He was regarded by many fellow naval officers as a hero, and he achieved great success in the Royal Navy. Now, after bringing the newly finished Roebuck to Halifax in Canada in late 1775, Hammond was ordered to take command of a squadron of smaller ships and to patrol and blockade the Chesapeake and Delaware Bays. And these are some of the ships that were assigned to him. His squadron included a pair of frigates, a pair of sloops, and several smaller ships that were called tenders. They would just have a few guns on them and a few men. And these ships could sail in the shallows. Every ship had at least one tender, and they would use them to communicate with people on shore, to secure provisions and to capture prizes. And when they captured prizes, they often outfitted those prizes with a smaller crew and a few guns and turned them into tenders as well. Pretty soon, the Roebuck squadron around the Chesapeake and the Delaware Bays had a fair number of little ships with it. The Roebuck sailed back and forth several times between the Chesapeake and Delaware Bays in the late winter and through the summer of 1776. Leaving a few ships to manage the Chesapeake blockade, Roebuck began cruising in earnest on the Delaware Capes in March of 76. So the best place to encounter enemy ships is not at sea, where that could be a hit or miss affair, but near the entrances to ports, rivers, and bays. So during this time, the squadron captured several ships around the Delaware Bay in the spring and summer of 76. And her total for prizes that year was 27 ships taken that were not sunken. And of course, this meant loot for everyone. Every sailor got a share of the value of each prize. So this was a very prosperous cruise in their first year. Now, there are some navigational features that make sailing in a bay or in a river much more difficult in some ways than sailing at sea. This coastal environment has a couple of extra factors. In addition to the wind and the tides really matter in a bay or in a river. And they also have a current. The Delaware River's current was about 2 to 2.5 miles an hour coming downstream. And then there's this issue of depth. There's lots and lots of shoals in rivers and in bays. Daylight, it's the time when you can operate and see your opponents, is important. And then finally, The maneuvering of other ships, whether they're your enemy or even friendly ships, can cause difficulty for a commander sailing a ship in a bay or a river like this. So a look at the shoals in the Delaware Bay shows just how difficult navigation can be. These long strands of muck and sand are washed down the river, and they're not very deep in places. The river might only be 12 feet deep in some of these places, or even less. So navigating this area without a pilot who knew the waters could be very dangerous. Roebuck's draft, as I mentioned, 18.5 feet at her lightest, 3 fathoms, caused her to run aground more than once in the Delaware. Many of the soundings on this map, these little numbers that you might be able to see, and we'll see a little bit more closely in a moment, many of these soundings were actually made by Hammond and his squadron. And the depths that we'll see are shown in fathoms, increments of 6 feet. Hammond said about this area, "I don't know any river so difficult of navigation." He used the smaller ships in his squadron to move around in the shallows. And when a ship ran aground, it would have to wait for changes in the tide to refloat it, often needing other boats to pull it off. They were stuck too fast in the mud. And when grounded, they were especially vulnerable to enemy action. American seamen were hiding in all these little creeks with small vessels, and they would take advantage of any opportunity to harass the British. Whenever a ship would get stuck, especially if it got washed ashore, they'd try to take it. On March the 28th, the Roebuck lost one of her boats when it ran aground like that during a chase, and 3rd Lieutenant George Ball and several seamen were captured. We're taking a look here at the area closer to Cape May Point. Actually, south is in this direction on the map. North is in this direction. It's opposite of what you're used to usually looking at. And this is Cape May Point, the very southern tip of New Jersey. So aware of the British presence in the bay, American merchant ships and privateers did their best to avoid Hammond's squadron, using their knowledge about the shoals in particular. So British and American ships played cat and mouse game around these capes. Privateers and merchant vessels tried to slip in and out of the bay, especially through this shallow New England Channel, named for an early whaling settlement near the Cape there. And crossing the bar at Cape May Point between these overfalls and the Cape itself is pretty dangerous because it's only 2.5 fathoms, 15 feet. The Roebuck couldn't pass through there. Hammond tried stationing the Roebuck near these overfalls and lost his anchor in the quicksand for his pains. The overfalls were between 6 feet and 3 fathoms, so 6 to 18 feet deep, not very deep in places, and it's just all broken ground, as it says on the map here. This is the detritus, the sand and the mud that's been washed down the coast over the centuries. If a ship slipped out of the capes, the warship could give chase, but couldn't always catch it. At 6 a.m. on March the 31st, 1776, the Roebuck sighted an armed brig dropping down the eastern side of the bay and heading out through the New England Channel. It was a 14-gun ship, the Lexington, under Captain John Barry, a famous American naval hero. Hammond said, made sail after a brig under Cape May, but being obliged to go around these overfalls, at 8 lost the sight of her. In this case, the mouse turned cat because the Lexington captured the Liverpool's tender, the Edward, just a few days later. So there were several encounters like this during the spring. Hammond's orders were not only to disrupt shipping, but to destroy the defenses that were being built upriver near Philadelphia. This proved to be a very tall task, too much for the small squadron of ships that he had. On May 4th, the Roebuck sailed upriver to investigate the defenses further upriver. And she sailed up there in company with the Liverpool, a frigate, and a brig and 2 tenders to procure fresh water and just see what the Pennsylvania Navy looked like. Note here, by the way, Reedy Island, says here Reed Island. This is a place where the British thought they might land troops if they came up the Delaware River. As they were sailing in the area of the Wilmington Creek, the Americans sent down what navy they had in the river. The Pennsylvania Navy came down. They had chased an armed sloop, which got aground near the Wilmington Creek entrance, and they were trying to unload it when these 13 row galleys from the Pennsylvania Navy, mounting 18 and 32-pound cannon in their bows, sailed down to confront them. And they also brought with them a fire ship and a 10-gun floating battery. So people crowded the riverbanks to watch what was going to happen here, watch the fireworks. These ships fought an inconclusive battle for about 3 hours. The warships had trouble hitting the small targets, and the galleys had problems with their own scoring hits. With the bow-mounted cannon, they had to aim their ship at their target. It wasn't that easy. Colonel Samuel Miles, a Pennsylvania military man, who was watching from the riverbank with 100 riflemen. He estimated that the ships exchanged between 300 and 400 shots that day, doing little damage. And while this was going on, an American armed schooner in the mouth of the Wilmington Creeks sallied out, snatched the British brig, and hauled it back into the creeks where the larger ships couldn't get. At the same time, the Roebuck itself got ashore around here at Kearny's Point on the Jersey side. And the American galleys swarmed closer to try to take her. And they brought her under musket fire even, eventually firing off all their musket ammunition. The Liverpool, that frigate, anchored just ahead of the Roebuck to protect her until they could get the ship off, but they couldn't move her before dark. So they were worried about fire rafts coming down and destroying the grounded ship. So they stationed their tenders around the ship and had boats on patrol all night. And next morning about 4 a.m. they got off when the tide raised. They got off in the fog, and with the wind behind them, and as the morning grew, they pursued the galleys upriver for about 2 hours. Then when they lost the wind, they stopped, sailed back down to the area of Newcastle, and the engagement was broken off. So the British situation in Virginia was bad when Roebuck had arrived in Chesapeake earlier in the year. John Murray, Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, had lost the battle at Great Bridge and fled aboard the Fowey and burnt the city of Newark. He tried to manage British affairs from shipboard, enlisting Hammond's aid in blockading Virginia, seizing American ships in an effort to prevent people from getting grain and flour on shore. As noted earlier, Hammond left a few ships at Dunmore's disposal and sailed for the Delaware. The Roebuck returned to the Chesapeake in May, however, to aid Hammond's attempt to pacify Virginia. And to gain a foothold on the land again, Dunmore landed Roebuck's and the other ship's Marines and the remnants of the Ethiopian regiment, not more than 200 men by this time, on May 26, and he established a fort on Gwynn's Island named Fort Hammond. They were there. They found that was a good place for them to draw water as well, so it was important to them. The Americans, however, erected batteries all along the shore, and by July 9th, they started to bombard it, and they drove Dunmore and the British Navy off the island. And that was the end, really, of the British presence in the Chesapeake Bay for a long time. At this time, this summer, disease was rampant in the Chesapeake. And during the summer, the Roebuck herself lost 30 seamen dead and had another 76 ill by the time she sailed for New York late in the summer. The summer of 1776, the British shifted their attention from New England to New York. Coordination between the Royal Navy and the British Army in America had been poor in 75, but the situation improved dramatically this year when Richard Howe was finally appointed Admiral of the Fleet in North America, and his brother William Howe as Commander-in-Chief of the Army. The two of them worked in harmony over the next couple of campaigns. Arriving off of Staten Island on August 14th, the Roebuck and Liverpool joined in the amphibious operations being launched on the waters around New York City. Though the fleet dominated the harbor, British operations were not completely safe because wood ships are highly flammable, and British by American row galleys and fire ships. Here you can see the Phoenix fending off one fire ship with poles. The Howe brothers got to see firsthand how dangerous small vessels could be in a confined space like a river. And this made an impression on them. When the British Army attacked the American positions on Long Island, the Battle of Brooklyn, the Roebuck was assigned to occupy the attention of a fort at Red Hook, which anchored the Americans' defensive works here. So this was primarily meant to be a diversion to keep the Americans inside their fortifications, as many of them as they could, while the main battle took place outside. Roebuck wasn't able to do much damage here, but she was hit several times from shore. 3 weeks later, the British landed on Manhattan Island. 5 ships bombarded the American entrenchments there, driving the Americans off. So the landing was basically unopposed. And one of those ships, of course, was the Roebuck. The Americans had blocked the Hudson at a narrow point between Fort Washington in New York and Fort Lee in New Jersey, where today the George Washington Bridge stands. A ferry ran here between the two banks. And if you've been there, you know that the river has steep palisades or cliffs on both sides at this point. And the forts sit atop them and were intended to be able to fire down on any ships passing by. The Americans sank a number of boats here and also placed hazards called chevaux de frise. And under cover of these defenses, the Americans were bringing supplies down to Washington's army from further upriver. So in early October, the brother of the ferryman here came to the British and he told them there was a passage open between the obstacles and that he could pilot their ships through them for a fee. So they decided they wanted to disrupt the American supply lines, and they decided to send a number of ships through this gap, running the gauntlet between the two forts. And those forts sported between them about 100 guns. At 4 a.m. on October 9th, 1776, Roebuck's crew barricaded the ship, essentially fortified it as best they could. And at 7 o'clock, they made sail up the Hudson. They were joined by 5 ships, led by Phoenix, a 44-gun ship like the Roebuck, under Captain Hyde Parker, who was senior to Hammond. And here we see the Phoenix, the Roebuck, and the Tartar, a 28-gun ship. Parker didn't completely trust the pilot, who he feared might be leading them into a trap where they'd be under these guns and not able to turn back quickly. So they placed a pair of loaded pistols on the binnacle as he piloted them up the river, telling the guide what his fate would be if the ships should stop in their passage. When they got to the boom, The pilot realized that he didn't actually recognize where the passage was. When he saw it from the water, he was confused. So under fire and within 40 yards of some of the guns on the shore, Hyde headed for the New York bank where he had heard that the water was deepest. It took them 60 to 90 minutes to pass through the bombardment, but all the ships got through. Here's a second version of this painting that belonged to the lieutenant from the Tartar. You can see the shells in this one. I like it. You can see the shells arcing down over the cliffs into the boats. They suffered quite a number of casualties and quite a bit of damage, though none of the ships were lost. The captain of the Tartar, who had the unlikely name of Cornthwaite Omni, left an account. He said that at 7 a.m., Wade came to sail in company with His Majesty's ships, Phoenix, Roebuck, Trial, Schooner, and 2 tenders. At 8, 5 batteries on the York and 2 on the Jersey shore began to fire on us. They likewise hove a number of shells with continual firing till 9:30. They hulled us several times, wounded our masts, and cut a great deal of the rigging and sails. A shot went through the mizzen mast and afterwards killed a midshipman. The splinters of the mast wounded the captain, lieutenant of Marines, and the pilot. And after passing the batteries, the enemy began to fire small arms from the woods, which they continued for several miles upstream. Phoenix in the lead lost 4 killed in action, 13 wounded, her mizzen mast entirely disabled, sails and rigging damaged, and the ship's boats shattered. She took 4 shots through the hull. The Roebuck lost 5 killed in action, including her lieutenant and a midshipman, and 7 wounded. And the small cutter that she was towing was shattered to pieces and cut adrift. This was an expensive demonstration of power. In trying to control a river like this, the British had to ask, how many times could they afford to do something like this? So waiting for them on the other side of the boom were 6 row galleys with cannon in the bows, like the ones we'd seen on the Delaware. And despite their damage, the British ships immediately went into action. They chased upriver the row galleys. They captured 2 of them. They captured 2 sloops and a schooner as well. And they also sank a sloop. And on board that sloop was David Bushnell's experimental Turtle submarine, which had just days before been used unsuccessfully against a British warship in the harbor. Bushnell later recovered it, but its ultimate fate is unknown. We don't know where it ended up. Later that afternoon, the little fleet came to anchor in the Tappan Zee off of Terrytown there. And to protect the anchorage, they fired several broadsides of canister at the troops on shore to scour the shore, as they put it. And this was interesting. At 6 p.m., they committed the bodies of the deceased to the deep. Well, I did understand burial at sea, but dumping bodies in a river just doesn't seem savory somehow. The focus of the 1777 campaign would be the rebel capital in Philadelphia. On July 30th, the British fleet carried the army down to the mouth of Delaware Bay, where Hammond came aboard Richard Howe's flagship, the Eagle. Historians often argue that Hammond gave an exaggerated description of the Delaware defenses, leading the Howe brothers to make a snap decision there to sail the long way around, coming up to Chesapeake and landing near the head of Elk instead of going up the Delaware Bay. So here we have Philadelphia, all the way up here, and they met down here at the Capes and eventually sailed like this all the way up to the head of Elk. But Hammond's knowledge of the bay and his experience in the Delaware did indeed lead him to advise caution about landing in the Delaware, especially because the galleys and the fire ships and the other small ships could wreak havoc with landing boats carrying troops. The fleet might not be able to protect all of them. But he suggested they land no farther up than Reedy Island, which I mentioned earlier, which is about here. But William Howe had already determined that he was going to sail up the Chesapeake, at least by June, weeks before the fleet left New York. Joseph Galloway, who testified before the House of Commons, said that Richard Howe had inadvertently revealed to him William's plan, and that when he tried to dissuade William Howe from the Chesapeake route, the general was put out that he had found out, and he wanted to know how Galloway had learned of his plan. But because Howe's mind was already made up, when the fleet met with Hammond and the Roebuck here at the mouth of the Delaware, it was a very brief meeting. Either landing place, the Elk River, which is up near the head of the Chesapeake, or a landing site below Newcastle around Reedy Island, would still necessitate maneuvering in the face of a determined enemy. A major confrontation with Washington was going to happen in this area, no matter where they landed. It was inevitable, and it was exactly what Howe was looking for. So Howe, by landing in the Chesapeake, had several potential objectives, not just the city of Philadelphia, but he also was interested in Washington's supply bases at Reading, Lancaster, York, and even as far away as Carlisle. Why he didn't pursue these, I'm not exactly sure, because Howe's papers were burned after the war accidentally. His house burned and the papers were lost. We don't know exactly what was in his mind, but I think he feared after landing here at the head of Elk that Washington might get between him and his expedition towards these supply bases. And so he declined to do that and started heading toward Philadelphia instead, fighting a battle at Brandywine on September 11th, and then finally crossing at a pair of fords fairly high up the Schuylkill River. There's not a real ford on the Schuylkill before the falls. The first ford is probably what they would call Levering Ford, where Manayunk is today. So in order to maneuver against Washington, Howe ended up crossing here. And if he had come up from Reedy Island or Newcastle or even Wilmington, he likely would have ended up going about the same distance and having about the same route, although he would have saved himself about 4 weeks of campaigning time. Here's a map of the Delaware in 1777. Operations to open the navigation of the Delaware, which was blocked by Chevaux de Frise, happened in several phases. So first, let's take a closer look at conditions on the river. In the best of times, sailing through this area could be perilous, under fire and with obstacles even more so. And there are a pair of forts here, Fort Mifflin on Mud Island and Fort Red Bank on the Jersey Shore. Fort Mercer at Red Bank on the Jersey Shore. This river is tidal all the way up to Trenton, where the falls are. The depth at low tide and high tide varies by as much as 5.5 feet, depending on the moon and the wind. And it's about 12.5 hours between high tides. Even that varies a bit. So the river's rising and falling. Sometimes the river is just flowing down, and then when the high tide comes, the surface of the river is flowing up while the current's flowing down. And the river, as I mentioned before, runs at about 2.5 miles an hour. The important thing here, too, is that the water is very shoaly. There are lots and lots of these sand and mud bars that didn't exist in the Hudson to the same degree. So it's a very treacherous area to try to sail through. This period map actually lists what the British were up against in the Delaware River. And here's a list of the rebel fleet. 13 galleys with guns as heavy as 32 pounds or 24 pounds in the bow, mostly 18s. A whole bunch of half galleys with smaller guns in the bows. Half a dozen ships, variously armed, several fire ships, a pair of heavily armed floating batteries, each of which had 10 guns on it, and a whole bunch of fire rafts. So this was a formidable fleet in an area where you could barely navigate. The first phase that they had to face here was to get through the line of Chevaux de Frise in the river by Billingsport. And we see it a little bit more closely. This is actually a fairly accurate number of chevaux de frise here. These are obstacles that have been sunk in the river. There were 60 some of them that were removed in about 1794. And you can see the depth of the channels here listed in fathoms. So this is 36 feet, not too bad. Over here, about 5 feet. And there's a back channel, but it's only 15 feet in depth, 2.5 fathoms in places. And up here, as low as 12 feet. So they couldn't get too many ships up that way, even though there were no chevaux. Let's take a look at what the chevaux de frise is. The chevaux de frise in action were a serious nuisance. These are long poles anchored in the river. Their intent is to pierce and sink passing ships. The tips are about 4 to 10 feet below the surface, so even at low tide, they'd be hard to see. And they were anchored by boxes that were sunken and filled with 15 to 20 tons of rock. And then they were chained together so that a ship couldn't just tip one over. After Hurricane Sandy in 2012, a cheval de frise was recovered from the river near Bristol, 30 miles north of Fort Mifflin. Over the years, and with the currents and the tides, it had washed up. So this one is now on display at Brandywine, I believe. The oak pole is 29 feet long, 13 inches in diameter at the base, and the iron point is 28 inches long. You can see what these look like. This is the actual tip of that cheval de frise that's being levered up there. A very formidable obstacle. Once they were able to pass above Billingsport, however, they had removed a few of these. The fort had been abandoned. The next phase was to attack Fort Mercer, which they needed to neutralize in order to be able to start removing the chevaux near Fort Mifflin. So they took one fort at a time, or at least they tried to. Let's take a closer look at this area here. Here's Fort Mercer on a bluff above the Delaware. Any ship trying to remove these chevaux de frise would be subject to the guns from the fort there. On October 22nd, 900 Hessians attacked the fort. And hearing the firing, the British decided that they would try to support the Hessian attack. There were a bunch of row galleys and other ships swarming around here, firing initially on the Hessians. So they figured they'd take some of the heat off of them. And the Augusta, third-rate 64-gun ship of the line, led the charge, heading up the bay here, heading up the river here, rather. So here's a drawing. It's an engraving from a drawing that a Lieutenant William Elliott actually made while he was watching this battle take place. And in it, we can see the Pearl. We have here the Roebuck and the Augusta. And here you can see the Pennsylvania Navy trading and exchanging shots with the British Navy there. We look closely, we can see the Merlin, which is partially obscured by the Augusta, and the Liverpool. Well, this didn't work out too well for the Augusta. She ran aground on October 23rd in this bar here, and she got stuck fast because she ran aground just as the tide started to ebb. So she was in increasingly shallower and shallower water and increasingly stuck on this bar. About the same time, in avoiding the Roebuck, Merlin moved to the side and also found itself stuck in this muck here. Roebuck and the other ships worked to pull off the Augusta during the night, but a contrary wind checked the flood. So the flood tide that should have come back up was held back by a wind that was heading downriver, and the Augusta couldn't be refloated. In the meantime, the Hessians broke off their attack here because they were repulsed with heavy losses and driven back. Next day, morning of October 23rd, with the Augusta still aground, the rebel galleys dropped down again and began firing on her. And after firing on the Augusta for 4 hours, with hot shot also coming from Fort Mifflin and a floating battery, the Augusta caught fire. Efforts to exchange the fire were in vain. And while she was being evacuated, they broke off in the middle because the fire had spread just too fast and too far. Expecting a massive explosion, the other ships weighed anchor and moved away from the Augusta, except for the Merlin, which was stuck a little bit downriver from her. She was evacuated in anticipation of the explosion and then set on fire to prevent her capture. After burning about 90 minutes, the flames finally reached Augusta's magazine, resulting in a tremendous blast. It was so strong it shattered windows in the city of Philadelphia, several miles upriver. The ground shook as though there was an earthquake, rocking Henry Melchior Muhlenberg's house, which was 28 miles away in Trapp, Pennsylvania. And Thomas Paine, who was near Chestnut Hill, saw a mushroom cloud rise over the river. About 3 p.m., the Merlin also blew up, although the explosion wasn't quite as tremendous. In 1937, you could still see some of the ribs of the old Roebuck. I'm sorry, the old Augusta in the river there. The court-martial found that the Augusta's loss was occasioned by accidentally taking fire in action with the rebels' armed vessels. Historians, especially the British, have ever afterwards emphasized the word accidentally, as though 4 hours of heavy fire from the Americans had nothing to do with it. Fact, the destruction of the Augusta was intentional. She was destroyed by enemy action. So the third phase of the campaign, to open the Delaware navigation, focused on Fort Mifflin on Mud Island. Batteries were built on land, and a pair of shallow draft ships, the Vigilant and Fury, moved up the inside channel to attack from close up. Let's take a closer look here. The fort came under fire from a lot of batteries that had been built on the Pennsylvania shore. 24 24 pounders here, 4 32-pounders from the rear, where the fort was not really, the walls weren't really built up yet. And probably most devastating of all, a pair of 8-inch howitzers and a pair of 8-inch mortars, which were lobbing shells on a high arc into the fort itself without having to go through the walls. And then when the fort was attacked at close range by the Vigilant and the Fury, they had a broadside of 9 24-pounders close up, and a number of smaller 9 and 6-pounders, plus Marines firing from the fighting tops and hurling grenades into the fort. So they were keeping men off the parapets, and they couldn't man their guns. Eventually, they took the fort, and here's a somewhat rude depiction of the fall of Fort Mifflin, the taking of Miss Mud Island. Fort Mifflin was bombed into submission by November 16th. And on November 18th, while under attack, Fort Mercer was also abandoned. Even after the fall of Fort Mifflin, the Delaware remained closed till the Royal Navy could lever up some of the chevaux de frise, and then supplies began trickling into the city, the narrow channel that had been opened. But people were still quite hungry in Philadelphia through much of December. During the winter, the work at the chevaux de frise was still not done. The British only ever removed a few of them. They made a channel wide enough to get some of the ships through. Liverpool, the frigate from Hammond's squadron, was badly damaged trying to remove them, and it required extensive repairs. And a Royal Navy victualler, Juliana, was sunk there on the Chevaux on December 1st, trying to get through the obstacles. It took 10 days for boats from the Roebuck, the Liverpool, the Pearl, and the Zebra to raise her. Nonetheless, 1777 had been a good year for the Roebuck's crew with 22 captures. And here we see 4 of the guard ships that were placed around Philadelphia to keep an eye on activities in the river until the river was frozen in. Hammond, who was at the mouth of Dock Creek, continued to supervise the smaller ships down around the Wilmington area. And he still had ample time and leisure to conduct a number of lavish entertainments and dinners that he gave aboard the Roebuck throughout the winter. Now, following the occupation of Philadelphia, the Roebuck continued to cruise, but didn't do so well. She took 3 prizes in 1778, 9 more in 1779, which was a good year, and wasn't involved again in a major campaign until the attack on Charleston in 1780. By this time, the British seemed to have run out of ideas. They continued their policy of seizing American seaports as though they could somehow end the war by doing this. And Charleston was going to be their new base of operations in the South. Because Charleston's harbor was so shallow, too shallow to admit ships of the line, Admiral Arbuthnot made the Roebuck his flagship for this invasion, and they crossed the bar past Fort Moultrie on April 9th, 1780, and attacked by both land and sea. Charleston surrendered on May 12th, one of the largest surrenders of the war. In this campaign, the Roebuck managed to take 10 more prizes in 1780. That was her last big year for prizes, as I was saying. Three days later, after Charleston fell, Hammond returned to England, and he regretted his service in the Chesapeake and Delaware Bay as a difficult time, saying he was most heartily tired of carrying on this sort of piratical war. It wasn't what he had trained for. In his absence, his nephew, Andrew Snape Douglas, who had served on the Roebuck since 1775, assumed command. And she cruised for a while, the Roebuck, off the Carolinas, the Delaware Capes, and Sandy Hook. But in 1781, she only took 2 more prizes. And then in July 1781, John Ward assumed command. He had been a captain under Hammond in the squadron. He sailed her ship back to England. She returned briefly to America in 1782, but captured only 1 more prize. On April 1st, 1783, the Roebuck's career as a warship was over. She was paid off, her crew dispersed, her guns removed and stored. During the Revolutionary War, Roebuck was credited with 74 partial or full captures between the years 76 and 82. And though her days as a warship were done, her naval service still wasn't over. She was reactivated as a hospital ship in the Caribbean during the wars against France in 1790 to 94. And she also served in the Caribbean through the Anglo-Dutch War in 1797 to 99, and then was credited with 4 partial prizes. And in 1799, she acted as a troop ship during the invasion of Holland and was credited with another 6 prizes or partial prizes. Finally, from 1802 to 1811, she was laid up in ordinary. She was turned into a floating houseboat. She became a receiving ship, a floating barracks harboring sailors. These are photos of ships from the early 19th century showing how Roebuck might have looked when she was converted to a receiving ship. Finally, the Roebuck was broken up at Sheerness in July 1811. She had served as a warship for about 9 years, had given good service for a total of 37 years, and was a legendary warship. In pacem requiescat. Before we end, I wanted to just introduce you for a moment to some excellent sources of information about the navies of this period. In particular, a monumental work in progress called Naval Documents of the American Revolution. Right now, this series covers 3.75 years of the Revolution's naval history, including documents from both America and Europe. And volume 1, published in 1964, starts December 1st, 1774. Volume 13, which was published fairly recently, 2019, carried the series up through August 15th of 1778. There's more to come, but I don't know that we're going to see all of it in our lifetimes. I have pasted, by the way, a few really good references in the chat, which you can see if you go into the chat sometime and scroll up to the top. You'll see Naval Documents of the Revolution. These are available as PDFs for free and are eminently searchable, a tremendous resource. I used a number of maps from the John Carter Brown Library map collection, which is tremendous. There's a really excellent site called 3 Decks, and it covers pretty much the age of sail, warships in the age of sail. They have information on 28,000 different ships, 46,000 different sailors, and over 1,000 naval engagements. Well worth checking out. And finally, if you're interested in ships plans and things like that, you can look at the link for the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. I also added a link for the American War of Independence at Sea, which John Fabiano sent me this morning. In memoriam, finally, not just for the Roebuck, I'd like to mention, once again, our friend Joseph F. Saliga, who passed away in December. For those who missed the last meeting, our founder and good friend, Joe, has finally gone to his reward. So finally, let me just show you the future topics. You can see what's coming up. In June, we're going to have Michael Harris talk about his book, The Battle of Germantown. Should be on Zoom. Joe Robleski, our own Joe Robleski, is going to be talking with us about Annis Boudinot Stockton. And this is going to be held live at Morven. Hopefully, we'll have a tour of Morven that day as well. So look forward to that. And then in December and March, we're going to hear first from Bill Welsh about Washington's lieutenant, and then from Steve Yasik about Dr. Benjamin Rush. So lots to look forward to here. Any questions or comments about our talk today?
Yeah, Bob, I have a question. Going back to the Hudson between Washington and Fort Lee.
Yeah.
Why did the Americans leave that channel open that, they had it pretty much blocked off, and you said that pilot was able, what the American ships didn't want to go north of where they were anyway. So I'm curious, is any reason why they left that channel open?
I don't know. I mean, they had a boom there, and maybe they thought the boom would prevent the ships from sailing through it, and they might have dislodged it. But from everything I read, I can't find an answer to that question. I don't know why.
It just seems strange.
They needed something so they could push their own fire ships through to get down to attack the British fleet, they're off of Staten Island and everything. So if they didn't leave a gap, the fire ships would just pile up against the Chevaux de Frise.
Well, of course, they wouldn't ignite them, I don't think, until they got through, but yes.
Well, no, they had fuses. They had fuses. They wouldn't ignite until they were through. Yeah. No, you don't light a fire ship, it would be burned out by the time it got down there, So they had to have some egress and access.
Right. Great. Other thoughts or observations or comments?
The question about privateering and the blockade running, how organized was it on each side, in your opinion? And was it a viable strategy for the British to simply close down America economically and let the patriots rot till they came to their senses?
Yeah, they thought it was a viable strategy. It didn't work. They had way too much coast to cover with far too few ships and a very determined opposition, because Americans lived by trade, and they weren't about to let that trade stop. And they needed supplies to manage the war, but they also just needed supplies and commerce. Life went on, And so I don't think it was a very viable strategy for the British to think that they could blockade, but they never quite caught on to the magnitude of the task that they were facing. They underestimated the Americans at almost every turn.
That was Sandwich's original plan to prosecute the war.
Yeah.
When they, in 75, just control a few of the major cities, deprive the Americans of products, and eventually they'll come around. It was really important when you look at how much of the clothing, et cetera, that the colonists depended on came from the Midlands.
Yeah, and of course, things were being smuggled in from Britain's rivals as well, France, Holland,
Yes,
Denmark.
and we were well practiced at taking advantage of that.
Sure were. Yes, sir. Did that answer your question, Steve? Or
One follow-up did Washington or Congress have some sort of department of blockade running? Was it ever organized to the point where people could put out requests and the rum would show up?
it was more organized by the individual states and their committees of safety and things like that. A lot of that was organized, and a lot of it was just, they would issue letters of marque, but a lot of it was entrepreneurship, opportunistic Americans in little boats, That was a very effective strategy. Oftentimes the American Revolution is compared to the Vietnam War. Guerrilla warfare can be very effective.
Thank you.
Yeah. How about I see, was that Hal?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had a question about what was the eventual or what actually happened then to Captain Hammond at the end?
Well,
How long did he go
went
back to Britain, or did he participate in the
back to
Napoleonic
England.
Wars?
He went back to England in 1780, and he got deeply involved in the administration of the Admiralty. He ended up retiring after decades as the comptroller of the Admiralty. And this may be a reason why he never became an admiral, because he shifted from seagoing management to management on land. But he was well regarded ever after.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and Admiral Howe, who had been a very successful commander in the 7 Years' War, had successful campaigns in 1776 and 1777, sort of. He was in disfavor for a while, but then he also bounced back and was the very sharp commander of what they called the glorious 1st of June, a victory over the French in the 1790 or something like that.
Well, that's debatable.
All right, debate.
Well, he defeated the French fleet, but the object of the French fleet, believe it or not, was to get the American convoy through to France, which had all, basically we paid off our debt to France with that one convoy. It was all wheat and flour. So you could say, yes, the British won a naval victory, but the French won the operational or strategic victory.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is just the most recent 30 seconds of a debate that has gone on now for well over 200 years.
Yeah. Well, the British are never ones to admit any failures when it comes to their Navy, no matter how egregious. Just like the Augusta, after 4 hours of fire and hot shot, catches fire, and they said, "Oh, it was an accident."
Well, of course.
Other
one interesting thing you might note in that initial battle between the Roebuck and the galleys of the Pennsylvania Navy, I think was that in March or April of 76.
Yeah, May.
Okay, May of 76, is that all the American gunboats were under the restriction of only using half charges. because ostensibly,
Really?
yeah, it says none of the balls could reach. They, a half charge means the ball only goes a mile instead of a mile and a half. Anyway, they said it was because they were lacking powder. And, of course, that's very believable. But I postulated in that Big Cannon article that prior to that happening, a lot of the cannon that were being cast at Cornwall, Hopewell, and the various furnaces, a lot of them, Rittenhouse had given up on trying to have them proved properly. And they knew that these guns would burst if they used a whole charge.
Oh, yeah.
So that was probably the real reason why they were only allowed to fire. See, they didn't think they would have to encounter or deal with the British, but there they were. So yeah, half charges. That's why. Otherwise, if they had used full charges, they would have pounded the Roebuck and the Liverpool, and I forget the other ones, but
Yeah, a couple little tenders.
but instead they were only allowed to use half charges.
Yeah, with a big gun on a gunboat.
Well,
can
yeah,
pull-
in general, the galleys, as Bob mentioned, they carried big 12s,
And
24s.
big 18s, 24s.
Yeah.
I don't know so much about the 32s. I think there was only one 32 in the entire Philadelphia campaign.
Yeah, only one on the list.
Well,
Yeah.
that's the one. It still exists at that State and Schuylkill Fish Club.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it's sitting in their backyard.
Yeah, but
Okay.
a gunboat can have too big a gun on it and can break the keel. The recoil can snap the keel. You can sink a gunboat by overpowering it.
Yeah. I've been wondering about that. So what happened? I mean, did they have a place for the gun to recoil, or was it?
No, the boat
Yeah.
recoils.
Huh?
The
Well,
boat recoils.
they had
The
to,
boat was the
the gun
recoil.
had to recoil or they wouldn't be able to reload it.
Right.
So, it had to recoil somewhat.
Yeah, but not much.
Yeah.
Not
And
much.
in fact, the State and Schuylkill's yacht was converted to one of the gunboats, and it was but it was a small fishing yacht.
Mhm.
It wasn't as big as one of the row galleys, and but it only mounted a 12-pounder.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, manning, those little row galleys, that took a little nerve to come up to a British warship with a broadside. But they had a hard time depressing their guns low enough to hit the things.
Well, that's true too, yeah. And of course, they were much more maneuverable, so they would try to get to, the stern or the bow.
Yeah,
You're not going to go broadside with a ship of the line,
a mosquito fleet.
right?
Yeah, well, that's Barbary pirate stuff.
Yeah.
It is, man. That's what they encountered all the time. They'd have frigate-sized boats, but they would swarm you with these little gnats.
Well, notice the Xebecs in the American order of battle.
Yeah. Lantine rigged frigates. That's what a Xebec is.
So I think that the Cheval de Frise that was recovered at Bristol is in Brandywine, but I haven't actually seen it.
There's a nice one at Fort Mercer in their display there.
Oh, yeah? I don't
Yeah,
remember.
no, they've got I think they've got the box too, not just the not just the pole.
Been there a couple of times, but I just don't remember it. It's been years, so.
It's in like a stable, like for keeping horses. Right outside the I forget the name of the house. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Woodall.
It's remarkable
Woodall.
how long
Woodall,
wood
yeah,
can
right.
last in fresh water. It's amazing. In salt water, that stuff would have been rotted away long ago, but in fresh water, for whatever reason, it gets preserved. It's like what's his name? Benedict Arnold's fleet off Valcour Island in Lake Champlain. They've been able to take up whole boats, reasonably well preserved. It's amazing.
Yeah. Hey, any other comments or questions?
Bob, did the Roebuck ever come close to losing a battle?
I don't think so. I mean, She had trouble. I'll tell you what, probably her most dangerous moment was when she ran aground off of Kearney's Point.
Right.
That was probably the most dangerous moment for her. But she recovered during the night. They managed to float her off by dawn and protect it during the night. The Americans, they were maybe a little more timid than they should have been, but it was obviously a dangerous thing to do. So, to come down there and challenge that ship. But that was probably her most dangerous moment. Other than that, she was kind of like the big bruiser, beating up on smaller vessels. She wasn't engaged in the kind of Bonhomme Richard exchanges of fire with other
Right,
warships that I
right.
know of.
Was
Oh,
she, was she
did she have,
present at
like-
the Battle of the Capes?
No, I don't think so. What were you going to say, Tom?
Was she I guess some of them had the copper sheathing on the hull. Did she have that or not?
I think they, when she went back to England, I think they put the sheathing on her. I believe it might have been, but it might have been about 1780. And then she came back in American waters briefly. So they were just making, so the British ships were starting to use this copper sheathing, which kept them running much more smoothly. They didn't get as many barnacles and things slowing them down. Regularly, a warship had to be careened periodically and have the hull cleaned of these marine organisms and things that slowed her up. Essentially, she could lose several knots of speed. So they started doing the copper bottoms, and I think the French might have been doing it a little bit before them, but some of you guys would know better than I would.
Well, you mentioned at the beginning of her career, she was in Halifax.
She went to Halifax, yeah,
Yeah, at
December,
the very beginning. That's where they would have coppered her bottom.
maybe, yeah. During the,
There were only two places where that could be done in North America, and one was Havana, and the other was Halifax.
right? I didn't know that. Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't know that one either.
Yeah, that's why the Spanish fleets and the British fleets didn't have to go back home. They could winter in those places. But the French, that's why D'Estaing, he's up there in Rhode Island, or he's down there in Charleston, and at the worst possible moments, he has to go back to France, and that's to clean the ships up.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll say this, the French in the grand strategy suckered the British pretty well. They were building up their naval force for years before the American Revolution, hoping that they would be able to cause just the kind of problem that they caused for them, because Britain was getting, too powerful. So it worked very well for them to finally, defeat the British in a couple of really important naval battles, especially the Capes. So.
Hey, where'd you go?
I don't know.
Where's Bob? Bob usually has some insightful question. What do you got for us tonight, Bob?
All I see is yellow.
Yeah.
Oh, you're back.
Oh, good.
You're back.
I have a question about, you mentioned that one of the ships was named Arnold, one of the American boats. And was that after Benedict Arnold?
It was a raft, not a raft,
Oh.
Floating battery. It had 10
Okay.
guns on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just reading about it on this one site that John sent me today, which I hadn't ever seen before. The American War of Independence at Sea. They've got lots of information about lots of ships there. And one of the things they have extensive information about is the Arnold. So check that link out and look for the Arnold.
Okay.
Learn more about her. I was surprised to see that Thomas Forrest, who was a captain under Proctor in Proctor's artillery, Thomas Forrest was originally, or earlier on, a lieutenant, I think, serving on the Arnold. I'm very surprised. He went on to live in Germantown till the end of his days, and periodically people would hear interesting stories from him. But anyway.
A lot of American seamen learned artillery in the Navy, and I suspect they moved them over to the Army because there wouldn't be that many artillerists in the Army. They'd have to learn how to fire the guns somewhere, and being on the ship is the easiest place to do it.
Well, do you remember that that drawing of the breaking of the Chevaux de Frise in the Hudson with Fort Washington on one side and Fort Lee on the other? Almost all those gunners were from Pennsylvania.
Hmm.
They were all
All right, flying
associated.
camp on the Jersey side and then the guys manning Fort Washington on the other.
Yeah, they were all from Pennsylvania. Yeah, they were all associators. Of course, that was really bad because when Fort Washington surrendered, it damn near took the state out of war.
That's why Pennsylvanians were not too warm supporters of Washington. A lot of the officers and a lot of the families never really liked them because of that loss of Fort Washington.
Right. Yeah, there were the 5 full battalions of what was Chester County Militia surrendered up there, and York County Militia, and I forget the other one, and plus the two battalions of line infantry that had been commanded by Mifflin, plus the gunners. Of the 3,000 men, only 100 of them were not from Pennsylvania.
Wow.
There was a company, believe it or not, of what was left of the Maryland men from the Battle of Brooklyn. There was roughly 100 men, a rifle company that belonged to the old, what were they called? The old line, or that regiment from Maryland.
Yeah, hold on.
A Maryland Rifle Company captured at Fort Washington, huh?
Yeah,
I'll have to look into that a little more. Thanks, Ed. That's
yeah,
good.
but other than that, there were, oh, I'll send you a full piece on it.
Yeah, please. Well, other comments or questions this evening? If not, I want to thank all of you for spending time with me this evening, and hope that you'll be coming back for some of our future talks.
All right, thank you, Bob.
Yeah, I was stimulated.
Thanks, Bob.
Good to see you guys.
Yeah, that was a good one. Appreciate it.
Yes, very interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you.